The snow didn't just fall, it smothered. It pressed down on the town of Ridgetop, burying the main street, silencing the world until the only sound left was the wind and the ugly whispers of men. And in the middle of that street stood Martha Calloway. They'd given her one satchel, one thin shawl, and a death sentence. Every door was closed to her, every shutter drawn tight. A voice hissed from a dark porch. "Bad luck, that one." Another man spat into a snowdrift. "Cursed." That was the word they'd chosen, the brand they'd burned on her. Cursed. Sheriff Amos Riker sat high on his horse, the lawman's star on his chest as cold as his eyes. He didn't look at her. He never looked at her. "You've been told, Martha," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "There ain't no place for you here." She wanted to scream, to remind them of the years she'd been a neighbor, the fevers she'd helped break, the children she'd watched, the bread she'd shared. But the words froze in her throat. Shame is a powerful thing. It can choke the truth right out of you. From the front of the crowd, Abigail Pike laughed, a sound as sharp and cruel as breaking ice. She was wrapped in a thick fur stole, a queen watching an execution. Best she go before she drags the rest of us down with her. Beside her, her young son Jonah shifted his feet. He looked from his mother's smug face to Martha's pale one. He was the only one in that whole town whose eyes held a flicker of doubt. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "Go on now. Take what you can carry." And so she did. She walked. Each step was a battle against the snow, each breath a stab of icy air. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The final sound she heard from the world she once knew was the heavy slam of the saloon door. A period on the end of her life. Then there was only the wilderness. The world beyond the town's last lantern was a different kind of monster. Trees clawed at the sky like skeletons, their branches heavy with snow. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and a cold so deep it felt like sorrow. Martha's boots crunched in the snow, a lonely rhythm in the vast silence. But soon, even that sound was gone, swallowed by the drifts. She was utterly alone, with nothing but the ghost of her own breath to prove she was still alive. For days, she walked. Or maybe she crawled. The time blurred into a single, unending nightmare of pain and cold. Hunger was a constant gnawing beast in her belly. She survived on memories. Her husband's laugh. The feel of his hand in hers before the sickness took him. Each memory was a small coal of warmth in the frozen wasteland of her heart, but it also reminded her of everything she'd lost. Everything they'd taken. By the second night, her lips were cracked and bleeding. By the third, her hands shook so badly she couldn't gather enough twigs to make a fire that lasted more than a few minutes. The cold didn't attack her. It crept. It seeped into her bones with the patient, unhurried certainty of a predator that knows its prey is already doomed. She wrapped the thin shawl tighter, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a handful of dirt. The word echoed in her mind. Cursed, cursed, cursed. It repeated with every step, with every shiver, until a part of her started to believe it. Maybe they were right. Maybe she deserved this. On the fourth day, the world went completely white. The snow and the sky merged into a blinding, endless void. There was no horizon, no path, only the deep ache in her limbs and the hollowness in her soul. Her knees finally gave out. The satchel, holding the last worthless remnants of her old life, fell from her shoulder and disappeared into the snow. She didn't even try to get it. She just lay there, her face pressed against the ice, and she thought, maybe this is it. Maybe it's better this way, better to just sleep, to let the white silence take her. It would be kinder than the jeering faces of the town. It was then that she heard it, a sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, or a trick of her starving mind. But it came again. Steady, Heavy. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Someone was walking through these woods. Someone who knew how to walk in them. Someone who wasn't afraid of the storm. With the last of her strength, she forced her eyes open. The world was a blur of white. A figure was walking out from between the pine trees. It was a man, broad as an oak, wrapped in coats of rough animal hide. His beard was as white as the snow, catching the frost like spun silver. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of a low-brimmed hat, narrowed. He just stood there, watching her, as if trying to decide if she was a ghost or just a dying woman. She tried to call out, to plead, but the cold had stolen her voice. He moved closer, his heavy boots sinking into the snow. He knelt beside her. A gloved hand reached out and brushed the snow from her cheek. He smelled of wood smoke and pine, a scent so real, so alive, it made her want to weep. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, gravelly rumble, like rocks tumbling down a mountainside. "You're coming with me." He didn't ask. He didn't offer comfort. It was a statement of fact. Before she could process it, he slipped his powerful arms beneath her and lifted her from the snow. She was weightless, a broken doll in his grasp. She felt the steady, solid beat of his heart against her ear, a rhythm unbothered by the howling wind. The world tilted and spun. Through blurry eyes, she saw the trees sliding past as he carried her. His steps were sure, unwavering. He was a part of this wilderness, not a victim of it. She wanted to ask him his name. She wanted to ask him why. Why save her, the cursed woman the whole world had thrown away? But her thoughts were a swirling fog, and darkness was pulling her down. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was a cabin, rising from the snow like some ancient secret. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a promise of warmth, a promise of life. He kicked the heavy door open and carried her inside. The wave of heat from a roaring fire washed over her, and he set her down gently on a cot near the hearth. Her eyes fluttered open one last time. In the flickering firelight, she saw his face clearly. He was older than she'd thought, his face a road map of deep lines carved by years of solitude and hardship. But his eyes held something that wasn't old at all. Something fierce, something unbroken. She was wrapped in a heavy quilt that smelled of pine and wool. She was safe. But mercy, she was discovering, could be just as terrifying as cruelty. It was an unknown country, and she had no idea what its laws were. As the darkness finally took her, she thought she heard his voice again. Softer this time, a whisper meant only for himself. "Don't you let go now." Was it a command? A promise? A prayer? She didn't know. All she knew was the warmth of the fire, and the terrifying mystery of the man who had pulled her back from the edge of death. When Martha's eyes opened again, the world was firelight and the scent of pine. The quilt was heavy on her shoulders, its rough wool a comforting anchor. She tried to sit up, but every muscle screamed in protest. Her breath plumed in the air. Even inside, the cold was a constant presence. Across the small room, the man sat by the fire. He was stirring a pot that hung over the flames, and the rich smell of stew filled the cabin. He didn't seem to notice she was awake. He was a study in stillness, a part of the landscape like the ancient pines outside. She tried to say thank you, but her throat was raw, and only a dry rasp came out. His head turned. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. There was no surprise, no pity, just a quiet, steady gaze. He stood up, ladled some of the stew into a tin bowl, and placed it on a small crate beside her cot. Then he sat back down, his hands resting on his knees, and went back to watching the fire. Her own hands trembled as she lifted the bowl. The first spoonful was so hot it burned her tongue, but the taste of real food, of salt and meat and herbs, was so overwhelming that tears streamed down her cheeks. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to wolf it down. Each swallow was a tether, pulling her back to the world of the living. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and looked at him. The silence in the cabin was thick, heavier than any snowdrift. "Why?" she whispered, the single word scraping her throat. He didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the dancing flames. After a long moment, he spoke, his voice still that low rumble. "Didn't see a reason to leave you for the wolves." It wasn't an act of kindness then. It was just practical. A simple calculation made by a man of the mountains. But there was something in his tone, a current running beneath the surface of the words, that she couldn't quite grasp. The blizzard raged outside, trapping them together. The cabin became their entire world. Days bled into nights. He moved with a quiet, efficient purpose, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, tending the fire. He was a man who wasted nothing, not a motion, not a word. As her strength returned, Martha tried to make herself useful. She swept the rough-planked floor with a makeshift broom of twigs. She used a bone needle she found to mend a tear in his coat cuff. She fetched buckets of snow to melt for water. They never spoke of it, but a fragile routine began to form between them. A silent language. He never thanked her, but in the evenings she'd find an extra log placed on her side of the hearth. He always set aside her portion of the stew before he ate his own. They were two ghosts, circling each other in the dim light of a lonely cabin. She learned to read his silences. The way his jaw would tighten when he looked out the single grimy window. The way his breathing would change in his sleep, as if he were wrestling with memories. One night, the wind howled like a banshee, and she woke to the sound of his voice. He was whispering. Names she didn't recognize. Sarah. Little Eli. His voice was thick with a grief so old it had become a part of him. The firelight caught the tremor in the hand that rested on his knee. She stayed perfectly still, pretending to be asleep. She felt like an intruder, a witness to a private agony. And in that moment, she understood. His solitude wasn't a choice. It was a prison. Her own ghosts were never far, either. She'd see the faces from Ridgetop in her dreams. Abigail Pike's sneer. Sheriff Riker's cold indifference. She'd wake up gasping, her heart pounding, convinced she was back on that frozen street. But then she'd see the steady glow of the embers in the hearth, and the large silent shape of the man sleeping across the room, and a strange sense of peace would settle over her. He carried no judgment, only a deep, weary acceptance. Finally, the storm broke. The world outside was reborn, blanketed in a pristine, glittering white. The silence was absolute. They stepped out of the cabin together, their breath hanging in the frigomare. The forest was a cathedral of ice and light. He went to check his snares, and for the first time, she saw something crack the granite mask of his face. A faint smile touched his lips as he lifted a fat rabbit from a trap. It wasn't happiness. It was the quiet, grim satisfaction of survival. But survival is a temporary state. Peace is a fleeting dream, because the world you leave behind never truly forgets you. The sound came first. A dull thudding, muffled by the deep snow. Then, the jingle of a horse's bridle. Martha froze. Her blood ran cold. She turned, her eyes wide with terror, scanning the tree line. And then she saw them. Sheriff Riker, Abigail Pike, and at least a dozen other men from town, riding up the narrow track he had forged, their faces hard and determined. They looked like an invading army. Riker reined in his horse just a few yards from the cabin. "Martha Calloway!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the still air. It was the voice of the law, but there was a tremor of something else in it, something greedy. "Your time playing hermit is over. You belong back with us." The word was a slap in the face. Belong. You cast me out, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Abigail Pike leaned forward in her saddle, her lips twisted into a venomous sneer. We didn't send you into the wilderness to shack up with some mountain savage. You've brought enough dishonor on yourself. Shame, hot and sharp, burned in Martha's cheeks. She risked a glance at the man beside her. He hadn't moved a muscle. He hadn't reached for the rifle that was leaning against the cabin wall. He just stood there, watching them. A silent, immovable mountain of a man. The sheriff's eyes flickered toward him, and for the first time, Riker looked uneasy. This ain't your quarrel, old man, the sheriff warned. His hand drifted down, resting on the butt of his pistol. Give her to us, and we'll be on our way. The old man's voice rumbled, low and dangerous as distant thunder. I ain't giving nobody over. The tension in the clearing became a living thing. You could feel it, taste it. The men on horseback shifted, their confidence wavering in the face of this one solitary man. Abigail Pike spat into the pure white snow. She's a curse! Everyone knows it! And you, living up here with your ghosts, you should know better than to take in bad luck. Something inside Martha snapped. It wasn't fear, it wasn't despair. It was the brittle, hollow shell of her shame, shattering into 1,000 pieces. She took a step forward. Her shoulders were straight, her chin was high. I will not go back, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. I will not return to a place that preaches piety on Sunday and turns its back on a neighbor in need on Monday. You call me cursed? I stand here today, alive, because a stranger showed me the mercy that none of you would. Abigail's face went crimson with rage. She opened her mouth to spew more venom, but another voice cut her off. A small voice, a trembling voice. It was Jonah, Abigail's son. Ma, he said, looking at his mother with wide, accusing eyes. She ain't cursed. You all just didn't want to see her hurting. It was easier to throw her away. His voice cracked on the last words, but his gaze never wavered. The silence that fell over the clearing was heavier than any blizzard. The men looked at each other, at the boy, at Martha. The certainty on their faces began to crumble, replaced by a dawning unease. Even the sheriff looked stunned, his hand frozen on his pistol. The old man's gaze swept across them, slow and deliberate. I've buried my own kin in these mountains, he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharpened axe. I won't bury Mercy too, not while I still draw breath. There was a power in his words, the raw gravity of a man who had seen the bottom of the world and climbed back out. It was more powerful than any gun. One by one, the men lowered their eyes. They turned their horses around, the mob mentality broken by the simple truth spoken by a boy and the quiet dignity of an old man. The sheriff, his authority shattered, said nothing. He just nudged his horse and followed them back down the trail. Only Abigail lingered, her face a mask of fury. But her own son's stare was a judgment she couldn't escape. With a strangled cry of rage, she wheeled her horse around and galloped after the others. When the last sound of hoofbeats faded, the world was still again. Martha stood beside the old man, her breath pluming in the cold air. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a feeling she hadn't known in years. Dignity. Later, inside the cabin, the fire crackled, a warm and welcome sound. She tended to it, her hands steady now. He sat in his usual spot, watching her. But the look in his eyes had changed. The distance was gone. The silence between them was different now, too. It wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things. It was fertile ground. You didn't have to do that, she said softly, looking at him. Stand for me. His eyes met hers, and they were as clear and steady as a mountain lake. Didn't reckon I could do otherwise. The simple words hung in the air between them, holding a meaning far deeper than either of them was ready to say. And in that moment, Martha understood. Survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about finding the courage in another person's soul to reclaim your own. Her life in Ridgetop was over. That was certain. But as she looked at the lined face of the man who had saved her, she realized something profound. Her life wasn't over at all. It was just beginning. A new kind of life took root in the small cabin. It was a life measured in sunrises and sunsets, in the stacking of firewood and the quiet simmering of the stew pot. The man's name, she learned, was Jedediah. He didn't offer it. She found it carved into the handle of an old axe. She started calling him that, and he didn't correct her. She found a small, locked chest tucked away under her cot. It was heavy, and she could hear something shifting inside when she moved it. She asked Jedediah about it once. His face closed up, becoming that familiar mask of stone, and he just shook his head. She didn't ask again. Some doors, she was learning, were best left unopened. But the cabin held other secrets. One afternoon, while sweeping near the hearth, she noticed a floorboard that was slightly looser than the others. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't felt in a long time, got the better of her. When Jedediah was out checking his traps, she pried it open. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a book. A journal. Her husband's journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands shook so violently she could barely untie the string. She opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, cramped handwriting. She started to read, and the world tilted on its axis. Her husband Samuel hadn't just been a simple miner. He'd been a prospector, a brilliant one. And he had found it. The mother lode. A vein of silver so rich it would have made them kings. He wrote about his plans, how he was going to tell her, how they would leave Ridgetop forever, buy a small farm somewhere green and gentle. He wrote of his love for her, his dreams for their future. And then the entries turned dark. He had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. He had trusted the wrong person. In a moment of excitement, over a bottle of whiskey, he had told Sheriff Amos Riker about his find. The last entry was short, the handwriting jagged and hurried. Riker knows. He came to the mine today. Asked too many questions. I don't trust his eyes. I don't trust the way he smiles. I'm moving the claim markers tonight. I feel like I'm being watched. The journal fell from her hands. The fever. They had told her he died of a fever that swept through the mining camp. But there was no mention of a fever in his journal. Only fear. The truth hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Samuel hadn't died of a fever. He'd been murdered, and the curse. It was all a lie. A cruel, calculated story cooked up by Riker to get her out of the way. He thought she knew where the mine was. He'd made her a pariah, homeless and desperate, so that he could break her, force her to tell him her husband's secret. Abigail Pike, with her petty cruelties and her influence over the townswomen, must have been his willing accomplice. The whole town had been a lie. She looked up, her vision blurring with tears of rage and grief. Through the cabin's small window, she saw Jedediah walking back through the snow, the rifle resting easy in the crook of his arm. And a new ice-cold fear gripped her. Who was this man? This silent hermit who just happened to find her in the middle of a blizzard? Who just happened to live in these mountains, so close to the mine? Was he another one of Riker's creatures? Was this cabin just another, more patient kind of cage? Had he saved her only to pry the secret from her himself? The man who had been her savior now looked like her potential executioner. The stew bubbled on the fire, but for the first time, the smell of it made Martha feel sick. Jedediah sat across from her, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shlick of steel on stone grating on her nerves. Every shadow in the cabin seemed to lengthen, to twist into menacing shapes. The rifle was leaning against the wall, closer to him than to her. The silence, once a comfort, was now a suffocating weight of suspicion. She had to know. Jedediah, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Did you know my husband? Samuel Calloway? The sound of the whetstone stopped. He didn't look up, but his hands went still. The silence stretched, tight as a wire. When he finally raised his head, his eyes were full of a pain so deep it startled her. "He was my partner," Jedediah said, his voice rough with emotion. "We found the silver together." The story came out in broken pieces, a tale of hope and betrayal. They had been friends, two men chasing a dream. But Samuel had been too trusting. After he told Riker, things changed. Riker started showing up with his men, asking questions, making threats. The day Samuel died, it wasn't a fever, it was a cave-in, a deliberately set cave-in. "Riker's men," Jedediah rasped, his knuckles white as he gripped the whetstone. "They set a charge at the mouth of the tunnel. Buried Samuel. They thought they buried me too. Left me for dead. He had been badly injured, but he'd managed to dig himself out. By the time he got back to town, the official story was already set in stone. Samuel Calloway, dead of a fever. Jedediah, the strange hermit, had simply vanished into the mountains, probably dead himself. He knew Riker would kill him if he showed his face, so he had stayed hidden, nursing his wounds and his hatred, a ghost haunting the mountain that had stolen his friend and his future. He had seen her cast out of town. He had followed her, watching from a distance, making sure the wolves didn't get her. He wasn't another jailer. He was a guardian. The relief that washed over Martha was so intense it made her dizzy. He wasn't her enemy. He was her ally. The only other person in the world who knew the truth. But their relief was short-lived. From the valley below, a sound began to rise. Not the jingle of a few bridles this time. It was the sound of many horses moving fast, and the sound of angry voices, carrying on the cold, clear air. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle. He peered out the small window. "It's Riker," he said, his voice grim. "And he's brought the whole damn town with him." This wasn't a posse coming to reclaim a wayward widow. This was a lynch mob. Riker must have realized that his authority was broken, that the story of the curse was falling apart. He was coming to finish what he started. To get the map he was sure Samuel had left behind, and to silence the two people who could expose him. There would be no reasoning with them this time. No appeals to conscience. The siege had begun. "Bar the door," Jedediah said, his voice deadly calm as he checked the load in his rifle. "And stay away from the window." The first shot cracked through the winter silence, splintering the wood of the doorframe just inches from Martha's head. They came out of the trees like a pack of wolves, their faces lit by torches, twisted with greed and fear. Riker was at their head, his face a mask of desperation. "Calloway!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the mountainside. "We know you're in there, and we know you have the map. Give it to us, and we'll let the woman go." Jedediah didn't answer. He just raised his rifle, took careful aim through a small chink in the cabin wall, and fired. The shot echoed through the valley. One of the torches fell into the snow, hissing as it was extinguished. The men scrambled for cover. "He's a liar," Jedediah muttered, reloading with practiced speed. "He wouldn't let either of us walk out of here alive." Martha's terror was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but a strange calm was settling over her. She had been a victim for too long. She had been pushed, scorned, and left to die. No more. While Jedediah laid down covering fire, she worked. She stoked the fire until it was roaring, sending thick plumes of smoke up the chimney. She found old rags and soaked them in oil from a lamp. She grabbed the pot of boiling stew off the fire. They were trapped, but they weren't helpless. The night was punctuated by the crack of rifle fire. Jedediah was a phenomenal shot. He wasn't trying to kill them, just to keep them back. But they were badly outnumbered. For every man he drove back, 2 more would creep forward. "They're trying to circle around to the back," he grunted, firing again. That was her cue. Martha moved to the cabin's single back window. She saw two figures creeping through the shadows. Taking a deep breath, she smashed the window pane with the bottom of the stew pot and hurled the scalding contents out into the darkness. A scream of pain and surprise tore through the night. The figures retreated. They had bought themselves a few more minutes, but it was a losing battle, and they both knew it. The firing stopped. An eerie silence fell over the snowy clearing. Then Riker's voice came again, low and menacing. "Last chance, old man! You can't stay in there forever. We've got enough oil to burn that cabin to the ground with you both in it." This was it, the end of the line. Martha looked at Jedediah. His face was grim in the firelight, but his eyes were steady. He wasn't afraid. He met her gaze, and in that moment, a lifetime of unspoken understanding passed between them. They would not die begging. Jedediah raised his rifle one last time. But before he could fire, a commotion erupted from within the ranks of the mob. A single figure pushed his way to the front. It was Jonah, Abigail Pike's son. His face was pale, but his eyes were blazing with a furious conviction. "Stop!" he screamed, his young voice cutting through the tension. "He's lying. All of it. It was never about a curse." Abigail rushed forward and grabbed her son's arm. "Jonah, get back here. You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do!" he cried, shaking her off. He held up a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. "I found this in your drawer, Ma. It's a letter. A letter from Sheriff Riker." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Riker's face went white. "He tells you everything in here." Jonah's voice trembled with rage and betrayal. "How Mr. Calloway found silver, and how the two of you planned to get it. How you invented the curse to drive Mrs. Calloway out. How he was going to get rid of her if she didn't talk." He turned to the stunned faces of the townsfolk. "They were using you. All of you. They promised to share the silver, but they were just using your fear to do their dirty work." The mob was no longer a mob. It was a gallery of shocked, betrayed faces. They turned as one, their expressions slowly shifting from greed to fury, to look at Sheriff Riker and Abigail Pike. The hunters had just become the hunted. The world held its breath. The only sound was the crackle of the few remaining torches. Sheriff Riker, his face a pasty gray, drew his pistol. "The boy is lying! He's a child! She's bewitched him!" But his words were hollow. The truth was there, in the shaking hand of the boy holding the letter, in the guilty terror on Abigail Pike's face. The townsfolk, who moments before had been ready to kill for him, now looked at him with cold contempt. They had been played for fools, their own superstitions and greed turned into a weapon against an innocent woman. The first man to move was a blacksmith whose wife Martha had nursed through pneumonia. He dropped his torch and took a slow, deliberate step toward the sheriff. Then another man followed, and another. They closed in, a silent, menacing circle of judgment. Riker's bluff had been called. His authority was gone, reduced to ash. He looked from face to face, searching for an ally, and finding only stone-cold fury. He panicked. He raised his pistol, not at the crowd, but toward the cabin. If he was going down, he would take the secret of the mine with him. But he never got the shot off. A rock, thrown from the crowd, struck him hard in the wrist. The pistol clattered into the snow. Before he could recover, the blacksmith was on him, his massive hands seizing the sheriff. The rest of the men surged forward, their pent-up rage finally unleashed. Abigail Pike screamed and tried to run, but two of the women she had so cruelly gossiped with caught her, their faces hard and unforgiving. Justice, when it finally comes, can be a brutal, messy thing. From inside the cabin, Martha and Jedediah watched as the town turned on its corrupt leaders. They saw Riker and Abigail bound with their own ropes, their pleas and threats ignored. The mob, their bloodlust now redirected, dragged their former leaders back down the mountain trail, their fates to be decided by a law colder and harsher than any winter storm. The last of the torchlight vanished into the trees. The hoofbeats faded. Silence returned to the mountain. Slowly, Jedediah unbarred the door. He and Martha stepped outside into the trampled snow. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of pine and powder and, for the first time, of freedom. They were alive. They were safe. They stood there for a long time, side by side, not speaking, just breathing in the cold, clean air of their new world. The long night was finally over. When spring finally came to the mountains, it was like a promise fulfilled. The snow retreated, giving way to patches of stubborn green grass. The streams, freed from their icy prisons, chattered and sang. Martha and Jedediah found the mine. It was just as Samuel's journal had described it, a deep scar in the mountainside, its entrance still partially blocked from the cave-in that had claimed his life. Inside, the walls glittered with a fortune beyond imagining. It was enough wealth to change the world. They stood there in the shimmering darkness, the light from their lantern dancing across the silver veins. This was what had driven Riker to murder, what had made a town lose its soul. Martha looked at Jedediah. His face was thoughtful. He reached out and touched the cold metallic wall. "He was a good man, your Samuel," he said quietly. "He just wanted to build a life for you." "This isn't a life," Martha said, looking around at the cold, dead riches. "It's a tomb." They made their decision without another word. Together, they sealed the entrance to the mine, burying the silver and the ghosts that came with it. Their real treasure wasn't under the mountain. It was the life they had built on top of it. The town of Ridgetop became a distant memory, a story they rarely told. Word trickled up the mountain now and then with a traveling trapper. Riker and Abigail had been run out of the county. The town was quieter now, poorer, perhaps a little wiser. Young Jonah had taken over the smithy and was known as a fair and honest man. Martha and Jedediah didn't need a town. They had the cabin, the forest, and each other. They found a new kind of wealth in the quiet rhythm of the seasons, in the shared warmth of the hearth on a cold night, in the comfortable silence of two people who had seen the worst of the world and found the best in each other. One evening, as the sun set, painting the peaks in shades of orange and purple, they stood outside the cabin, looking down at the valley below. "Do you ever miss it?" Martha asked. Jedediah put his arm around her shoulders. "I've got everything I need right here." They had survived the storm. Not just the one that raged outside, but the one that raged in the hearts of men. They had found that mercy, once given, can take root and grow in the most unlikely of places. They had found a home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the map.